Hey, Dame,
Yo,
do you happen to have any idea who this episode is brought to you by?
oh, I think I have a clue. I think I know.
This episode of Ergo is brought to you by Overcast, an independent podcast app that embraces the open world of podcasting instead of locking it down. No exclusives, no premium content, no paywalls, just a great podcast app for everyone.
And if you know Ergo, we love independent and we love shit not being locked down. So,
So go ahead and get Overcast for free on the App Store.
Hi there, this is friend of the show and self-proclaimed honorary third Ergo host, Eve Ewing. This year, I curated a series called the Black Freedom Lectures, which was dedicated to talking with renowned Black scholars to share knowledge and spark discussion on topics with an explicit Black liberation lens. We sat down with the speakers after each lecture and had some great conversations. And throughout the month of August, we're sharing those conversations with you as special episodes of Ergo. So today you're going to hear a Q&A of me interviewing one of our guests. If you want to learn more or if you're curious to see the original lecture, visit our website, blackfreedomlectures.org. If you don't want to do all that, I promise it will still be a great conversation. On this episode, you'll hear from C. Riley Snorton talking with me about Black trans histories. Enjoy! Please join me in welcoming my esteemed colleague, C. Riley Snorton. Professor Snorton is a professor of English language and literature at the University of Chicago with a joint appointment in the department and the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Snorton is a cultural theorist who focuses on racial, sexual, and transgender histories and cultural productions. He's the author of a couple of great books. One is Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, and Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. If you didn't get a chance to already catch our video that dropped last week, you can hear Professor Snorton read from the preface of Black on Both Sides. And some of those comments are going to frame our conversation today. The book Black on Both Sides has won a lot of amazing prizes, including the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction, the Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies, an honorable mention from the American Library Association. Shout out to librarians. And Snorton is also the co-editor of Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value. Please join me in welcoming Professor Snorton. Yay, people are clapping for you and celebrating you. I also see that you have a really great hoodie on that's made by our collective, our shared friend, Pigeon Pagonis. And if folks don't know, you should go get your own Too Cute to Be Binary shirts and hoodies on Pigeon's page.
Absolutely.
How are you feeling?
I am hanging in. And I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be in conversation. I want to thank folks who are tuned in and listening. And I want to thank you also for providing that moment for some collective grieving, or perhaps to collectively feel enraged in this particular moment. It happens to also be, I believe, National Day of Gratitude. So I think it's kind of appropriate to start with some thanks, even as we're holding a whole set of emotions all at once.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that it might sound discordant, but for me, gratitude is one of the things that keeps me going on days like today, because I know that our community is really strong and that we are organized and that we are prepared to show up for each other in the ways that are necessary. So I also want to welcome our ASL interpreter, Barb, and say that I'm really grateful for her being here. And also to say thank you. I promise I'll stop since you said it was gratitude. Also to say thank you to the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture for making this conversation possible, and the Mellon Foundation, and all of our amazing staff and partners who've made it possible for you and I to hop on a computer and talk. Okay, so I have so many questions for you. I also want to let folks know that they can post questions in the chat, and we will be, if we have time, and if I don't run my mouth for an entire hour, I would love to ask questions that people have. So please feel free to post questions in the chat, and I'm sure that Professor Snorton would be open to answering questions that are not just about the lecture. So if you have general, smart, interesting questions, please share them. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a lot of like, what did you mean by that? Because your lecture just dropped so much truth and so much that really left me with a lot to chew on. So the first thing I want to ask you about is you frame the preface of your book by talking about what you call the necessary simultaneity of Black liberation and trans liberation. I'm so proud of myself for saying the noun simultaneity, the necessary simultaneity of Black liberation and trans liberation, right? That one has to happen alongside the other. Could you just talk more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. What a great way to get into the conversation. So let me think about how I would start to unpack that. In one sense, what I'm suggesting is that if we think about gender as a kind of the modern system of gender as a colonial construct, that in many ways, and as the book kind of lays out in later chapters, necessitated, for example, kind of brutal experiments on enslaved Black people, which creates the conditions for the possibility of something like transgender to emerge in the mid 20th century. Then we see one of the ways that Blackness and transness are imbricated with each other or share a relationship with each other. Now, certainly it's not the same thing, but they are interrelated processes. And so if we think about the liberation of Black folks, we also are calling for a liberation to the ways in which the colonial construct of gender has been mapped onto the ways that Black people experience themselves, but also as it continues to be a kind of ongoing site of pressure, of violence, of a kind of rendering of proximity to premature forms of death that structure how trans people maneuver in the world. I think certainly, by kind of talking through Laverne Cox's own kind of site of public grief, it really highlights also the ways that we see the kind of violence against trans communities as, in fact, being much more acutely attuned to Black and brown trans people. And so these are, these are not only allied, but they are implicated political struggles.
Are you saying, tell me if this is an incorrect rephrase of what you're saying. Are you saying that we should understand the invention of something like Blackness or the Black as a category and the invention of something like gender and, binaristic categories of gender as both happening at the same time through the same colonial project? Would that be accurate?
That's great. And I would say, in addition to that, that the kind of sexual scientists, the ones who are developing what it is that we take as the kind of precepts or the kind of ways of thinking about gender as being mapped onto anatomy and et cetera, right? Gender and sex. That those folks were also deeply involved in eugenicist projects, right? Mm-hmm. So that the kind of the pathologization of transness and Blackness are happening simultaneously as well.
Literally by the same people. The same folks. That's really, I really appreciate that framing. And I think that one of the things I think that is powerful about your work and about your book is the idea of exploring Black trans histories. I think that because many of us grow up in a very patriarchal society, which we'll talk about, and a very kind of gender repressive society, that people think transness like just got invented or this came out is a new thing. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about some of the trans people, Black trans people moments in Black trans histories that you write about in your book that folks should go look up and learn more about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of the reason for looking at the past, that there were really two reasons that I wanted to write a history. One was precisely a kind of reaction to the idea that trans people are new. And it seems like, I mean, even if you look at the 20th century, like people thought trans people were new when Christine Jorgensen becomes this kind of celebrity figure in the early 50s. But then, it gets reinvented over and over again. One might say that people rediscover trans people whenever there's a kind of emergence of a trans celebrity. The other reason, though, is that I was deeply interested in thinking about what kinds of strategies for living did Black trans people deploy in the past that we might be able to think through and use and be inspired by in the present and in the future. And so some of the figures that have been so meaningful and exciting to learn more about include trans figures who come out of the 1950s or who we know about from their lives in the 1950s, who have often been not given their due attention in trans histories, but who are, there are people like Carlette Brown, who's a shake dancer in Harlem, who is like really actually trying to seek getting out of the country in order to get her proper, the kind of medicalized surgery that she was interested in. There was another woman named Carlette, who's actually from Chicago.
Two Carlettes.
Yeah, this is the story of two Carlettes. Popular name must be in the 50s. So so there's a story of a Carlette from Chicago who famously told the court, like, if I'm a man, then I don't know that, nor does my community. And so, there's just all of these stories where, I mean, often we don't know about them except by the ways that they were criminalized. So we get them through court records and the kind of sensational media stories that were told about them. But in these stories are also like there's like beautiful and inspiring moments of people talking back to the state that is attempting to construct them other than how they see themselves. I'd also say that some of the most fascinating work was looking at stories of Black trans folks living in the 19th century. And one of the a kind of chilling artifact, which is a pickup notice, a notice that people used for to enlist slave catchers or to find formerly enslaved Black people who had escaped and bring them back to their enslavers. There was a pickup notice of a person who, they were like, believes she. Well, I'm gonna use the pronouns that I feel most comfortable with. Believes she's a woman, believes she's free. And to like see those sentences side by side in this notification of a person who was in jail and awaiting the kind of possibility of whether or not they were going to be brought back to their enslaver. These are the kinds of stories that populate and live across Black on both sides.
That juxtaposition, believe she's a woman, believe she's free, is astonishing. And it points to something you said a minute ago, which is, how do we look at these histories for exemplars of the freedom dream, right? Wow. And that's something I want to touch on more, because I think a lot of what you were pushing towards in your lecture was ways of thinking about Blackness and transness that is not about seeking state inclusion. Right. And I have really detailed notes on this. You wrote, the quantified abstraction of Black and trans deaths reveals the calculated value of Black and trans lives through state grammars of deficit and debt. And what you're calling for is the opposite, where you said media focus on trans people's abilities to use the bathroom of their choice obscures a more urgent conversation about what modes of dispossession are possible under the ruse of state inclusion. What would a trans politics in theory look like that refuses such murderous inclusion? Yeah. So I could just quote back smart things that you said for a long time, but help us unpack that. What do you, and how do we think about, this is a big one, I think, for all marginalized peoples. How do we think about our sense of aspiration beyond a desire for inclusion in the same systems that dehumanize us, right? So what else is there? Help us see something else, Riley. What else should we be asking for? I'm tempted to go with several different metaphors. One about what does it mean to try to get a seat at the table when the table is broken. One about what does it mean to try to get into the house when the house is on fire. And so I'm thinking, right, like the kind of project of inclusion is often freighted by this idea
that somehow by including, we also will be transforming and making that very space better.
Right.
While at the same time, we survive by way of other modes and other systems. And so I think part of the project in Black on Both Sides, and especially in this current moment where we're seeing a proliferation of anti-trans bills at the state level everywhere, right, is, it is about looking to and valuing differently the kinds of structures of support that make Black and trans survival possible. And so, some of that is about the various ways that we've already provided roadmaps for thinking about other ways of survival, other ways of safety, other ways of mutual aid. And so the pivot can't be, what does it mean to become a full citizen in a state that in many ways and through many functions and institutions is able to maintain itself by way of
our devastation.
Exclusion. That's right. And so this is the kind of language of deficit and debt. Like this is also the ways that capitalism works. That it is to say, sometimes inclusion is about sometimes inclusion can become a way to further expose oneself to technologies of extraction, to technologies of dispossession.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. That is inclusion. Like, people really want it. They really want to be part. And it's the thing that we're trained to want. It's the thing that we're told to want.
Yeah.
And I wonder, relatedly, I wonder how you resist the idea. So one idea that I think you just kind of disabused us of is the idea that like freedom means inclusion at a poison well. Yeah. Another thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is the idea that what we should aspire to is the visibility of our own demise, right? Like that the more videos and the more kind of graphic representation of death, the better. And I think that for trans people, this is obviously, I think for all Black people, this is salient. For trans people, this is really salient because how do you, on the one hand, strive for recognition? How do you strive for remembrance? How do you strive for acknowledgement, for memorialization, for all the things that we know our lost siblings are due, that they owe, that they are owed, while also not making that the totality of how our bodies are seen. So help us through that.
I think, it's interesting. I was actually thinking about visibility before you said the question, because I think I often think about when we consider what visibility can mean, we also need to consider visible to whom.
Right.
And so I think very often people are like, oh, so-and-so is invisible. But I'm like, but they're visible to me. They are cared for in these communities. And so, there is a kind of another dimension for me in kind of the research and writing and political work that I'm doing that's about holding a space where people can be honored and valorized without necessarily becoming instrumentalized. And I think that's some of the trickiness of visibility. It's obviously something that many of us deeply care about, to feel recognized, to feel seen. But it's also that, and I think in particularly when we think about things like the various ways that the many deaths of Black and brown, mostly trans women, have been mobilized towards efforts where they are no longer in the room. They're no longer leading those efforts. They are no longer, their voices are no longer being heard. And so to kind of think that the kind of spectacle of violence somehow we have to disarticulate that the spectacle of violence means justice for those who are most likely to be violated or to be abused in the kind of broader social.
Yeah, especially because, as you said, we are already visible to those for whom we are beloved.
Yeah.
And the systems that harm us are already visible to us, right? And so this idea of like uplifting the visibility of those things, I think you're really prompting me to think about to whom, for whom, and for what ends.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that it's never good or purposeful to kind of, work on this issue of visibility, but it's like, for what, right? There's a moment, you already mentioned the iconic Laverne Cox, and there's a moment in your lecture, as well as in the preface, where you talk about an interview that Laverne Cox is doing, and she kind of interrupts the flow of time by she's doing this interview, and she stops the interview to acknowledge that she is in mourning. And you said she is challenging teleological notions of progress. Can you explain what that means to people who may have never heard the word teleological before, and why it matters?
I mean, I think the quickest way to describe it is that, like, she is purposely disrupting an understanding of time as moving from point A to point B, and the logic that we experience change over time. One of my favorite ways of thinking about that is actually in the work of Invisible Man, where the unnamed protagonist says that he experiences time like a boomerang, that it keeps hitting him, right? And this is how he knows how he's located in time, not as a kind of A to B progression or on a linear progression, but rather that time can work most often works in a cyclical fashion.
It's kind of like, that's like an echolocation version of time. I've been writing this book about Afrofuturism for like a million years. And one of the things, I think if I ever finish, hopefully I finish it, but I'm not going to, I'm trying out here. But to me, one of the most important ideas in Afrofuturism, as I understand it, because part of why I like to write about Afrofuturism is that it's unsettled. So I get to make an argument. So in my vision of Afrofuturism, exactly what you said is really important, which is, I think that Black people have always had a very nonlinear vision of time. And I think that there's so much that becomes possible when we stop thinking about time that way. One thing that it reminds us to do is to resist the notion of progress that you're talking about. And I have to say, with love and respect to people who use this phrase, one of my least favorite phrases is like, I can't believe this is happening in insert year here, right? And people said it 10 years ago, they said it 5 years ago. And it's like, at some point, maybe the year that it is doesn't matter, right? Maybe this eternal return of the same thing. There's not a question there. I just want to talk about Afrofuturism. But if you want to say anything about Afrofuturism, go for it.
Well, also, big admirer, reader, student of. But yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying as well was just making me think a little bit about, so often how we experience time is as it's invented by, for example, capital in the sense of the time of work, or as it's invented by the state, as in it's also tax day, right? That there's all these ways that if we think about time, if we unsettle time, we also get to be inventors of time too.
Yes. So, two things before I ask you my next question. One, I want to remind folks that if you have a question, you can post it in the chat. Second, this is a great time to mention, because we've been talking about how incredible your book is, that we will actually be giving away some copies of your book. And so if you are watching this video and you want to tell us what you think of our conversation, there's a really, really short feedback form you can fill out, and we'll be sending it out through our newsletter, which is at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. If you sign up for the newsletter, we'll send out the feedback form probably on Monday, and you can get a copy of Dr. Snorton's incredible book. And we'll be purchasing those from Semicolon Bookstore, which is a Black-owned bookstore here in the Chi. So, another word that you used in your lecture that some people might not know, but that I think is really helpful, is the idea of sociogenesis. Everybody's going to come away from this talk with, I was like, I hope everybody has their vocabulary notebooks out. What is sociogenesis, and why is that a helpful concept for us why is it a helpful word for us to know?
So sociogenesis is a term that comes out of Frantz Fanon, and
the OG that people should,
exactly. The only epigraph of the preface in the book. The problem under consideration here is time. and part of what he is doing in Black Skin, White Masks is setting up an understanding of like there is no way of understanding an individual's pathology without also thinking about what is pathological about the culture or about the social.
Oh, you ain't said nothing but a word today because wow.
Right. So it's about the inextricability of the self and the social. And so part of then the way that term gets taken up, and for example, Sylvia Wynter, is to say, well, if we're talking about there is no necessary distinction between an individual and a kind of larger social collective, then we get to reinvent what it means to be, for example, a human, what it means to be and this is what I feel like is part of what Blake Brockington was doing in his political organizing, right? He was like redefining what it means to be trans in relation to his particular social setting in North Carolina as a Black activist, as a trans activist. So I hope that kind of begins to demystify that term a bit more.
Yes, I love it. I wrote making a we, right? It's like how we make a we collectively in space. Yeah. Could you talk to us a little bit about Blake Brockington and about his story and why it's a story you wanted to include in the book?
Yeah.
If you feel able to do so.
It is. I mean, I want to take on the question. And I also feel like in thinking about Blake Brockington, it makes me think about the situation of today and sitting with what is it, one way of beginning to respond is to say that I believe 33 is considered the age of elder, like being an elder status as a trans person, given the set of circumstances in which so many folks are prematurely murdered or die. And so I remember seeing the news stories of Blake Brockington winning the Homecoming Award. And I was just like, whatever, like interested in that as a piece of news.
Right.
And then I remember seeing the news of his death and thinking about at that time, probably just at the time of like seeing that probably had just become, elder status as a trans person. And thinking about, what I think Janet Mock also has said so beautifully in Redefining Realness, that is about like, the context of being politically aware and being oriented towards Black and trans survival and thrivance is a way of sitting also with survivor's guilt. And, Blake grew up in North Carolina. I spent a lot of my childhood in South Carolina, and I just really wanted to meaningfully reflect and to insist on honoring his life, especially as so much of what you would find online, even now, is oriented around his death. But I think it was also about imagining what it would have been like for us to have had some kind of other mode of sociality. What would like to imagine what those conversations are like. And I think in some ways, this Black on Both Sides and some of the newer work that I'm thinking about is like, what does it mean to honor the dead? What does it mean to learn from ghosts? What does it mean to live with ghosts? And Blake is just a really important person to me. Mm-hmm. Since the book came out, I've met so many folks who have been friends of Blake, and that's been some of the most incredible conversations where, in some ways, to briefly return to our conversations that we were having about visibility, it was about the often and very reasonable fear that so many trans people have about being misremembered in and after their death. And so for that to be there and for people to let me know about their relationship with him it really amplifies the kind of stakes, both political and ethical, of what it means to name some of these folks who we continue to be in community with through other spiritual modes.
And it really, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And second of all, I think it really highlights what we were talking about a minute ago in terms of visibility, because there's a form of remembrance that is making someone visible on the terms through which they desire their visibility. And I think that that's really important. And yes, also very interested in what it means to continue to have these relationships spiritually with our folks after they're gone. And I think that when we lose people, it amplifies the necessity of that, right? Like you have to develop some sort of spiritual or ancestral practice, I think. I'm going to ask you a few more questions, and then we have a couple audience questions. So this is my last vocabulary question, I promise.
Okay.
Talk to us about the word tranifesting, which is a great portmanteau that you mentioned in the preface.
Yeah. So first, shout out to Kai Green and Trevor Ellison for developing the term. And their sense of it is that kind of collective sense of self-determination. And so it felt important to also highlight that there is language that is already in circulation about what it is that's at stake. And there's a lot, there's a big conversation, and maybe some of the questions that people have are about thinking about the kind of shared desire for self-determination among trans folks and among Black folks. But that was a gesture of community incitation, and also a way of saying, again, that like, that people are generating the language to name what it means to live in extraordinary and unimaginable circumstances.
Yes, thank you. That was I was like, I'm so glad I learned this word today. So one of the things you mentioned, HB2 and also the more recent spate of anti-trans legislation. And in the education community, I want to shout out some of my colleagues who have done a lot of work to try to really highlight the way that this legislation specifically targets young people.
Right.
Could you talk about what do people need to know? I know this is not your, totally, you're not a legal scholar, but you are a very knowledgeable person. What do people need to know about these legal fights over the rights of trans people to live their lives unencumbered that are happening right now?
So, first, let me say that my political orientation is for the complete decriminalization of trans people, right? And that these bills look very differently. Some of these bills are about restricting trans people's movement, i.e., whether they can go to the bathroom. Some of these bills are about, and there's a particular bill that I think is in fact just being discussed today, that about teachers having to report if young people are trans.
Yes, looping in teachers as kind of carceral agents of the state.
Exactly. And so, they have a lot of different particularities, and the fight to respond. I mean, shout out to Chase Strangio and a number of folks who have been doing this work through ACLU, through Trans Law Center, through Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. But what I understand to be needed is that they're going to have to take it to each state and do a kind of court proceeding. There's a lot of labor and resources that are needed to respond to this slate. And I hope that these organizations are ones that people will consider supporting.
Can you tell us if there's one in particular that's your favorite that folks should go look up and drop some coins if they can?
I don't want to pick favorites, but okay. I'll say those names again.
Everybody get your pens out.
Yeah. I'm lifting up the the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. I'm lifting up Transgender Law Center. And I also want to say that there's a really strong trans advocacy division in the ACLU.
In the ACLU. Got it. Okay. Got it. As I'm hearing you talk, I think right away of the iconic quote from our our always mother, Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
And the reminder that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that idea of distraction is what comes to mind, right? When I hear about this push, this wave, because it is such a waste of the time of so many talented people, and I think that's another form of hurtfulness. The most direct hurtfulness is the ongoing criminalization of trans people and trans young people and trans people of all ages that we know compiles upon these other systems that we're already talking about, right?
Yeah.
But man, like what a waste of time.
Yeah.
Like what a massive waste of time. It's really frustrating, really frustrating.
Yeah, it's super frustrating. It occurs as pressure. It's like when so often we've been talking about living in and with a COVID pandemic while also living in a kind of epidemic of state violence, an epidemic of anti-trans. The word that I often use is animus because it kind of it's a scaffold for all kinds of
hate, yes.
Exactly. And anti-Black animus and violence. And so, it's like it's like in some ways it's like feeling like you're in a pressure cooker.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And then also then like imagining then all the kinds of folks who have to be marshaled just to turn it down a little bit, just to deal with the bill that is coming up in one particular state, because each of these are going to take their own legal strategy and legal team.
And I hope that the educators who might be watching this really think about the ways that our schools are already set up to normalize the surveillance criminalization of our young people that facilitates, it makes it really easy to engage in something that is truly evil and truly immoral under the guise of I'm just following the rules. I'm just doing my job, right? And that we're asking teachers as state actors to potentially put their jobs and their livelihoods on the line and make a decision, right? But that's a decision. It's a decision you have to make, right? So I want to call on folks to think about that and to be prepared, to be courageous,
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to ask you 3 more questions from me and then 2 more questions from, I think just 2 more questions, well, possibly more. Oh, good. Okay. Somebody asked the same question that I was about to ask, which is this person and I would like to know, we said, we really appreciate your idea of entanglement as not quite the same thing as solidarity. Could you talk about that more? Shouts to that person. We're right here.
Yeah. So I've been wondering about what it would mean for us to truly see each other as ourselves. And I think often solidarity is, I think it's powerful. I think it's beautiful. I often sign my emails in solidarity with meaning. But I often think solidarity is about saying, well, these are my issues and these are your issues and we're going to come together. And so I've been trying to think about what entanglement offers that is, that ratchets up the stakes of solidarity in a certain way, where it's like, honestly, as I understand my situatedness toward liberation, it cannot happen without you. And so this is the language that I've been reaching toward. But I also think, it's a way of thinking about like not just who do we bring and what do we bring to the table, but what do we have to give up in order for this other new world to emerge. And so, so much of what this moment of living in the public health pandemic and the global public health pandemic has meant for me has to be really a kind of better student of abolition. And I think from that framework, I've been thinking entanglement, and I've been thinking about all the things we gain by losing some of the things that we might imagine are important to how we identify ourselves.
All the things we gain by losing the things that we imagine are important to how we identify ourselves. That's really incredible. I also really like the word entanglement because we can't, because Jada Pinkett Smith has now forever redefined how we think about entanglement. So it's also kind of like a wink and a nod to Black people, like entanglement.
Yes.
So I want to build on what you just said, because you shared that this year has created a pivot point in your thinking about the relationships between Blackness, transness, and abolition as interrelated practices. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key ways that I see those as interrelated practices is through something that I'm really in the kind of early phases of trying to work out, trying to wrap my mind around, which is like what's possible by embracing a political and political imperative, a political thinking of it as a kind of benefit to us to operate from the principle of uncertainty. That like, what would it look like if it wasn't that we were trying to say, oh yes, trans people should be here and non-binary people should be here, but to really sit with uncertainty as a way of organizing what we think we know about our gender and anybody else's gender. And so I've been thinking about this is in some ways born out of some conversation, a kind of conversation that I've been sitting with for a while, where people were kind of around the dinner table talking about like, oh, this is pre-COVID. We were around the dinner table, but we were talking about.
I was judging. I was definitely judging it.
I was like, we were talking about like what would how would we have something where trans people actually got to live more livable lives? And